Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online developmental psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in developmental psychology. This week we'll be looking at social cognition and moral development. So let's jump into it. Beginning with a definition of social cognition. Social cognition can be defined as thinking about the perceptions, thoughts, emotions, motives, and behaviors of self, other people, groups, and even whole social systems. Ability to understand human psychology, describe other people, and adopt other people's perspectives. So just kind of a social understanding of each other, that other people exist, and that they have their own motivations, emotions, and behaviors, and kind of that process of thinking about those other people's behaviors as well as kind of the proficiency in which your ability to do so, to successfully kind of conduct those cognitive processes. Our next term, theory of mind, is defined as understanding that peoples have mental states such as desires, beliefs, and intentions, and those mental states guide their behavior. A false belief task assesses the understanding that people A can hold incorrect beliefs, and B, those beliefs, even though incorrect, can influence their behavior. So this is a classic, kind of the only, typically, kind of feature of social cognition that's discussed, and not only the main kind of feature of social cognition that's discussed, but theory of mind is often kind of just framed and really even talked about as really just one aspect of theory of mind, and that is specifically this false belief task. And the typical task that's used is something called like Sally-Sue test, something along those lines. And basically the idea here is there are a child who watches a set of cartoon or animated, depending on if it's a picture or a video, but two school-age girls playing with basically a toy. And what happens is one of the girls walks away, so we'll just say Sally Sue, and you see Sally leave a toy in like a toy chest, for example, or something along those lines. And Sally, who again placed the toy in a toy chest, then leaves the room. Well, while Sally's out of the room, Sue moves the toy out from the toy chest to, I don't know, whatever. She puts it under the couch. Next, you ask the child who's actually reading this, comic or watching this video. You ask, where is it that Sally will look for the toy? Because remember, Sally put the toy inside the toy chest, the box, and Sue moved it without her knowledge, right? So you would expect the Sally to look in the place where she left it, that is the toy chest. However, the idea here is that children will not recognize that Sally doesn't have the same information that they have, aka that Sue moved the toy from its original location, from the toy chest to under the couch or wherever. So because of that limitation, because of quote-unquote a kind of underdeveloped or kind of limited theory of mind, as measured through this false belief task, the children who are viewing this comic or watching this movie will incorrectly assume that Sally will have the same information as them that they have by watching the comic, and thus will look for the toy in the new location that is under the couch instead of the location where she originally left it, that is in the toy chest. So that's basically the dynamic here and the typical classic test that's used. So continuing on with developing a theory of mind, 85% of 4-year-olds passed the false belief task, 80% of children with autism failed replication problems. Autistic children may display social deficits because they lack a theory of mind, have mind blindness. So this is kind of the theory here. So we have children who can pass this test. However, autistic children are unable to do so because they kind of lack theory of mind. They lack social cognition, or have an underdeveloped theory of mind, for example. And therefore they have quote unquote mind blindness, aka like the inability to recognize other people's have motives and different understandings of themselves. So that's the traditional framework. However, numerous studies found that there are replication problems with this finding in autistic children, wherein they don't fail at these massive rates. And this has been demonstrated in one study that I linked here. But not only that, I want to talk about a different theory of social cognition, and that's really never talked about in textbooks, but it's especially popular among autistic communities, and also more so kind of in the, well, I should say it's developed in the UK because the theories of all these different developmental outcomes are different in different countries, and specifically kind of in the UK they kind of reject the applied behavioral analysis kind of framework. And but one specific theory developed by an autistic researcher from the UK, Damien Milton, is called the double empathy problem. So let's define that problem. This theory of the double empathy problem suggests that when people with very different experiences of the world interact with each other, they will struggle to empathize with each other. This is likely to be exacerbated through differences in language, use, and comprehension. Recent research has found that in experimental conditions, non-autistic people struggle to read the emotions of autistic participants or form negative first impressions of autistic people. Such evidence would suggest that the dominant psychological theories of autism are partial explanations at best. So rather than autistic people having kind of this deficit approach wherein they lack the theory of mind, they lack literally the ability. And think of going back to our definitions of social cognitions. That is kind of a classic understanding of what humans are. You know, this ability to be social creatures, to think about other people's perceptions, thoughts, emotions, motives, right? So kind of the theory by saying literally 80% of, as per the false belief test, that 80% of children cannot pass this test, you're kind of basically saying, and then, autistic children in that case, but autistic people in general have this mind blindness. They have this inability to kind of perform basic social functions of humanity, which is, obviously quite offensive. And not only that, but as we saw in previous studies, that this finding is not consistently replicated. An alternative theory, again, this double empathy problem, argues that people have just different experiences of the world and kind of cognitive perceptions of the world. We talked about in previous chapters throughout this course, really, cross-cultural differences, wherein people cognitively process the world differently. And this is reflective in neuroimaging data, for example. So rather than it being a deficit, just being in an alternative way, that individuals cognitively process the world. And specifically for the double empathy problem, Dr. Milton argues that people experiencing the world in very different ways, they will be prone to lack empathy for each other or struggle to empathize with each other. And in the case of autistic individuals, this can be exacerbated due to differences in language use and comprehension. And there's empirical evidence for this. So a study found that when non-autistic people look at or watch the behavior of autistic individuals, they struggle to accurately identify and read and understand the emotions of autistic people's behaviors. Why it's going on, what is their motivation, what it is exactly they're doing, and as a result, the kind of that frustration of not understanding is kind of correlated with having a negative first impression of autistic people. And kind of an interesting little short film, I think it's like 10 minutes or something, is kind of from, it's called Loop on Pixar. It's on Disney Plus, so you can watch it there if there's a free trial, or just, find it online for free. That's kind of like, looks kind of presents this in kind of a animated form, this dynamic. Now let's continue on with this theory, expand on it a little more. So according to the theory of the double empathy problem, these issues are not due to autistic cognition alone, but a breakdown in reciprocity and mutual understanding that can happen between people with very differing ways of experiencing the world. So if one has ever experienced a conversation with someone who does not share a first language with, or even an interest in the topic of a conversation, one may briefly experience something similar. This theory would also suggest that those with similar experiences are more likely to form connections and a level of understanding which has ramifications in regard to autistic people being able to meet one another. So the image on the right is actually kind of from a pamphlet that details the double empathy problem for children. Just any non-adult really, but it's useful for really anyone who, because as I stated, this theory is not discussed, especially in the U.S. And the first citation within this book is from Sacha Baron Cohen, who frankly is hated by the autistic community for kind of the implications of the theory, as we talked about before. Just imagine what it feels like, really, to be characterized as lacking a theory of mind, having mind blindness. It's also often referred to as kind of male brain, because the theory was that only males can have autism, and kind of the onset of autism is really just a full expression of quote-unquote the male brain, which is obviously loaded with many problematic gender stereotypes for both males and females. But kind of the general overview, though, here is when interacting, a autistic individual and a non-autistic individual are interacting, they both bring strengths and weaknesses to kind of conversations. Thus, both parties may struggle to understand each other's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and differences, just kind of due to different experiences. And relatedly, kind of different cognitive approaches of interacting with the world, and these differences create difficulties in understanding each other. So, kind of in the real world applied, having separating autistic individuals, or kind of just marginalize them with particular scientific theories, kind of contributes to decreases in the frequency of interaction between these two groups of people. Thus, kind of going back to that example of an individual not sharing your first language, or kind of being uninterested in what you're talking about, this kind of that distance created by particular ways of organizing the world, and also reinforced through the particular scientific theories of the development of autism, can create kind of social distance towards these two groups of individuals, which can contribute to larger empathy gaps, which can be harmful for autistic people and non-autistic people interacting, but also with autistic people communicating with each other. And this could be through a whole host of reasons. One possible theory, the stereotype threat that we've discussed throughout this class, wherein you recognize that you are not this asocial non-human, but kind of in the presence of the stereotype threats, kind of acting in a particular way, and thus kind of socially isolating, and then which is obviously harmful for an individual to be isolated, being free of social contacts. It's harmful for multiple developmental outcomes. And specific studies have actually looked at this. So autism and the double empathy problem, implication for development and mental health. And just kind of quickly going through the abstract here. This article proposes a link between autistic people being misperceived by the neurotypical majority and their being at risk of poor mental health and well-being. We present a transactional account of development in which the misperceptions and consequent behavior of the neurotypical majority influence the perceptions and behavior of autistic people such that they become increasingly separate and indeed isolated from mainstream society. This jeopardizes their mental health and prevents autistic people from developing to full potential. This situation is not only problematic for the development of autistic people, but is also to the detriment of wider society, insofar as autistic people are effectively prevented from contributing fully. This account assumes that some, not necessarily all, autistic people yearn to be included, to be productive, and to be useful. It thus directly opposes accounts that view autism as an extreme case of diminished social motivation. So we've talked about this again throughout this class. From day one, I told you our understandings of people's behaviors and what's motivating them has real life and death consequences. In this case, perceiving and misperceiving autistic individuals' behavior and had just kind of their essence as a human being, lacking social motivation, contributes to autistic individuals being separated and isolated from mainstream society, which obviously has serious consequences. And in this case, a study looking at mental health with kind of that isolation, that double empathy problem, and kind of the acceptance of particular theories contributing to the development of mental health issues in autistic individuals. Okay, so now kind of getting back to the quote-unquote textbook material. So Wellman proposed children's theory of mind develops in two phases: desire psychology. Children talk about what they want and explain their own behavior and that of others in terms of wants or desires. Belief desire psychology. Understand that people do what they do because they desire certain things and because they believe that certain actions will help them fulfill their desires. Late elementary school, children grasp that different minds construct different views of reality. Their interpretations of events are influenced by these views. So kind of the general idea here is that as children age, they understand that people have different brains than you, and they have kind of different interpretations and different motivations when interacting in the world. And these particular interpretations of the world and of events existing within the world are influenced by different views of the world around them. So kind of that they have different ways of cognitively processing the world, and that can be social or cognitive or other cognitive systems, and that interpretation or that different understanding of the world contributes to interpretations kind of the world around them. Other non-human primates develop theory of mind. So chimpanzees, gorillas, and other great apes share with humans some basic theory of mind skills. Developing a theory of mind requires a certain level of neurological and cognitive maturation. Mirror neurons evolved in a theory of mind. Neurons are activated both when we perform an action or when we observe someone else perform the same actions. Some researchers argue that there is no mirror neuron system. So this is kind of presented in the textbook, and the kind of neuroimators that I talk to always lose their mind at this. And so there are many proponents that argue that there is no mirror neuron kind of system. Some argue that really all neurons are capable of or many neurons are capable of kind of acting in this mirror way. So basically kind of idea here is this classic task where like there was some kind of ape or monkey. If you have them eat a banana and put them in a neuroimaging machine and as they eat a banana, and you'll see certain correlates of brain activity associated with eating a banana. Then they accidentally left the whatever neural device on the monkey as someone else ate the banana, and then theoretically the same. Well, they claimed that that this same kind of neural activity was activated when the monkey watched whatever the human experimenter eat the banana, thus kind of giving support for this theorized mirror neuron system, which is thought to so kind of the implication here is that by me watching you do something, it activates kind of the same neurological processes in me, thus kind of giving me this empathy, thus giving me this higher level of social cognition necessary to exist as a human, as being an ultra social species and kind of participating in the world. Many neuroscientists dispute this mirror neuron system, but that's kind of the general theory. And in general, I would say that many, if not most, neural research suggests that that's not the case. But it was presented in the book, so I've included it in the slides. Trait perception. Young people perceive others in terms of their physical appearance, possessions, or activities. So at age 7 or 8, approximately, some kind of like middle childhood, children's descriptions of people show that they think about others in terms of their enduring psychological traits, such as Sarah is me. Adolescents see people as unique individuals with distinctive personality traits. Sarah is mean because she wouldn't pass the ball in NBA 2K on PlayStation 5. So kind of the idea here is that as children age, they are able to kind of just not give these blanket statements of Sarah is mean, but rather recognize that people are unique individuals and have different motivations or whatever. But kind of the idea is they're also ascribing a reason for quote-unquote Sarah being mean. In this case, Sarah's not passing me the ball in this video game. So with time, with development, children recognizing that individuals are, quote unquote unique, have distinctive personality traits, and they underlying the reasons for their characterizations of individuals is particular behaviors committed by that individual. Perspective taking, role taking skills are the ability to adopt another person's perspective and understand her thoughts and feelings. By age 8 to 10, children appreciate that two people can have different points of view, able to think about their own views and the thoughts of another person, can understand why your parents don't say don't run by the pool, but they'll understand I want to do a backflip. By age 12, they become capable of mentally juggling multiple perspectives, includes generalized other or a broader social group. Will consider how their parents react when they break the rules, and if their friends' parents would react similarly. So, kind of the idea here is kind of straightforward perspective taking, and that's kind of one important aspect of perspective taking is role taking skills, wherein children are able to appreciate and recognize that people can have two different points of view. They are able to think about their own thoughts and another person's thoughts, so they can be told to do something, but at the same time recognize that they are still able to kind of choose to do something else. But not only that, as children continue to age, they're able to kind of think more in abstract terms and use their role-taking skills in more abstract ways, I should say, including kind of this generalized other, which kind of is just this hypothetical other person kind of representing the norms of a culture that I can keep in my head and then kind of weigh. I can whether that generalized other, that kind of that this abstract notion of all cultural values, skills, etc., kind of just being averaged, and then weighing whether that generalized other will kind of approve of my activities, or what will another person think about me, or what would they do, and kind of along those lines. So they're kind of this abstract person, and they can kind of also kind of abstractly create a whole scenario wherein they can imagine their friends' parents reacting to them bombing their physics test and comparing that to how their parents would react to them bombing their physics test. Social cognition in adulthood. Social cognitive skills continue to improve after adolescence. Middle-aged adults are more able than adolescents to see both sides of the issues and to integrate the perspectives of both parties into workable solutions. Social cognitive skills hold up better during adulthood than non-social cognitive skills. People use these abilities each day. They do not need to use mentally taxing cognitive processes. When elderly adults do show declines, they are due to declines in fluid intelligence, executive control processes, information processing speed, and memory. So kind of the idea that is basically the same as the previous slide, that through time, children are able to understand other people have different perspectives and motivations, but not only that, but then come to kind of workable solutions to consider those different perspectives, those different interests and intentions, and then find a reasonable solution. Social skills hold up better in adulthood than non-social skills, and one reason may be because people just talk more than doing complex mathematics on a daily basis. So maybe this kind of practice effect, but also because it's also meaningful. So not just practice, but communicating with your grandchildren, your parents, your community members is personally meaningful to an individual, and thus they will be motivated to maintain their social cognitive skills. However, where elderly adults do show decline, as we talked about in previous courses, this is previous chapters. This is disputed, but it's centered around processing speech, memory, and fluid intelligence. So kind of just these creative solutions and balancing multiple pieces of information in their mind at the same time. However, the performance on those type of tasks are correlated with kind of the speed requirements of the task. That is, if you eliminate the speed components of a task, older adults will typically perform very close to, if not similar, the same levels as younger adults on particular tasks involving executive control processes. Moving on to morality. There are hypothesized to be three basic components of morality. Emotional component, feeling regarding right or wrong actions that motivate moral thoughts. A cognitive component, how we think about right and wrong and make decisions about how we behave. And a behavioral component, how we behave when we experience the temptation to cheat or are called upon to help a needy person. So kind of broadly speaking, the idea here is how we feel, how we think, how we act. So a psychoanalytic theory of morality. Research suggests that moral emotions are an important part of morality, motivating moral behavior. Early relationships with parents contribute to moral development, and children must internalize moral standards if they are to behave morally when no authority figure is present. So basically this is just saying that parents contribute to the development of morality, and they argue that children must internalize these moral standards if they are behave morally in the presence with no authority figure present, right? Because there's no one kind of checking them to make them behave morally. So in order to act morally independently, they must internalize those moral standards. Empathy, vicarious experiencing of another person's feelings. An emotional process, not a specific emotion. Can motivate prosocial behavior, positive social acts helping/sharing that reflects concern for the welfare of others. Keep us from engaging in antisocial behavior that violates social norms, rules, or laws, and often harms other people or society. So kind of the idea here, empathy, this emotional process wherein we vicariously experience the world, specifically vicariously experience another person's feelings, which thus kind of allows us to understand the perspective of others and thus motivate us to behave pro-socially. So kind of being concerned with the general welfare of others, helping, sharing, kind of all those good things, and minimizing antisocial behaviors, breaking harm and doing specific harm to other individuals, for example. So kind of this psychoanalytical approach, more a focus on the emotional component of morality development, but even there, you can see with this empathy emotional process, it's still cognitively related, and that just kind of speaks to, although there are, quote unquote, three theorized components of morality, it's not a super clean cut. There will always be some crossover, but kind of the idea here is that just overall, parenting is important, internalization of moral standards are important, and having empathy for others is important and contributes to the development and the likelihood of behaving morally. The next theory of moral reasoning we're going to look at is cognitive developmental theory. Cognitive developmental theorists study morality via development of moral reasoning. Thinking process is involved in deciding whether an act is right or wrong. Moral development is assumed to depend on social cognitive development. Moral reasoning is said to progress through universal stages. Each represents a consistent way of thinking about moral issues. Everyone follows the same sequence. Concerns with how we decide what to do, not what we decide or what we actually do. So from the name, what cognitive developmental theorists are primarily interested in is moral reasoning. So cognition, reasoning, and specifically thinking processes of deciding whether an act is wrong or right. And they believe that this development occurs in stage-like processes, wherein, just like all other stage theories, that it's similar to a set of stairs. At each step, you acquire certain abilities, and in this case, based on and influenced and really kind of unlocked by this advancement in cognitive development. In this case, moral reasoning and the ability to think about whether something is right or wrong. Thus, they're really not concerned about what an individual actually decides to do or what they actually do, but really concerned about the process, how they go about deciding something. What is their moral reasoning when making a moral decision? And the most famous of this is Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning. Kohlberg argued that moral growth progresses through 3 broad moral levels. The first level is pre-conventional morality, where rules are external to the self rather than internalized. Conventional morality, individual has internalized many moral values. Post-conventional morality, individual defines what is right in terms of broad principles of justice. So kind of the idea here is for pre-conventional, just someone tells me what to do, so therefore I'm going to do it. My mom says don't take cookies from the cookie jar, so I'm not going to do so. Conventional morality kind of deals with being told what the rules are, and then you kind of internalizing yourself and kind of being able to self-regulate based on those moral values explicitly told to you. Post-conventional morality kind of takes a different approach. So they define morality in terms of these broad social justice, kind of universal principles of justice and morality that is not necessarily reflected in their country's laws or norms. So we kind of got being told exactly what to do and just doing it, being told what to do, and then kind of this internalization process where you can self-regulate, and then versus an individual having these kind of universal, more theoretical understandings of what moral behavior is, and then acting in ways that reflect that universal principle of justice. And Kohlberg influences on moral thinking. Kohlberg believed the main influences on moral development are cognitive growth and social interaction with peers. They need, in order to develop morally, children need Piaget's formal operational thinking. And moral growth is facilitated by discussions about moral issues, advanced schooling, going to college, and participating in complex democratic societies where people weigh various opinions and appreciate that laws reflect a consensus of citizens. So kind of the idea here, going back to the cognitive emphasis of moral development for Kohlberg, is it really just needs Piaget's formal operational thinking. So it kind of makes sense. You need to be able to think abstractly in purely hypothetical scenarios in order to come up with moral decisions, because kind of the idea here is you're thinking through various moral scenarios and that aren't actually happening right in front of you. So therefore, you need to have the ability to think through these abstract concepts and purely hypothetical scenarios in order to develop morally. And moral growth is facilitated by, and you can see here the kind of American biases or influence on this, not just American, but a kind of just Western bias on this theory within Kohlberg. So the idea here is that going to college in advanced schooling is necessary for moral development. So individuals who don't go to college are unable to reach that third level, that post-conventional level of morality. And discussions about moral issues, again, kind of this Western idea that we're going to debate things, we're going to talk about things, and through these debates, that's kind of as a society, that's how we grow, that's how we develop. And then participating in complex, quote, democratic societies. What exactly that means for Kohlberg is generally just the Western view of kind of democracy, wherein, there are markets that exist and citizens participate in quote-unquote democracy through representative democracy, so voting once in a while. So a specific idea of what democracy is specific idea of how you go about developing the moral developments, going to kind of higher education, and this emphasis on kind of debate and discussion about moral issues. And then going back to even Piaget's, kind of that Piaget theory of kind of unlocking abilities at each stage, and through this kind of growth, this stage-like process, developing the ability to think morally. So this is kind of just like the classic example. And experimenters will just administer this prompt to some participants, and basically the prompt is as follows. A woman was near death from cancer. A drug exists that can save her. The manufacturer is charging 10 times what it costs to make. The woman's husband tried to borrow money and tried every legal way, but couldn't get $2,000. The pharmaceutical company refuses to sell it for cheaper. The husband is desperate and considers breaking into the store to steal the drug. So then you ask the participant, what should they do? And you can see at each different levels, depending on should the husband steal the drug or should not steal the drug. There are different moral reasoning associated with the level of moral development as defined by Kohlberg's stages. So pre-conventional morality, kind of just dealing with this immediate consequences and being told what you can and cannot do. So it's very immediate. It's positives and negatives, consequences, and rewards. So in this case, he should steal it because he can get away with it. He shouldn't steal it because he might get caught. Conventional, others will look down on him if he lets his wife die, and it's against the law. So kind of this idea that I've internalized the laws around me. I've internalized kind of the social shame associated with breaking the law, but also if I did not break the law and I let my wife die, I'll kind of experience kind of this social shame, this internalizing kind of the social shame associated with the cultural norms, that is letting your wife die, versus post-conventional morality. So you see here these very broad concepts of society. So the husband should not steal a drug because doing so violates a basic social contract needed to preserve civilization. Thou shalt not steal. So you can either take this in secular terms or biblical terms. The idea that if everybody just steals anytime they think it's correct, even if it's correct, this will lead to a breakdown of society. And more biblical terms, it's against the Ten Commandments. Versus the husband should steal the drug. The protection of human life is a higher moral principle that can overrule laws against stealing. So although there are laws against stealing, this pharmaceutical arrangement is inherently unjust and leading to the death of innocent people unnecessarily. Thus, this higher principle of justice overrules the country's laws, and thus stealing is morally correct in this scenario. Next, I want to bring in different theories that challenge Kohlberg. And again, this is typically not presented in textbooks, but I teach a class called Psych, Society and Culture, which is basically just cross-cultural psychology. So I'm bringing in some material from there. So there are two competing interpretations that have been discussed to explain the cultural differences seen in research on Kohlberg's stage model, stage theory of development. The first explanation is that the educational system in the West allows people to reach the third level. Although this explanation is maybe ethnocentric, and that it presupposes that the third stage is the best stage, and that the primary way to reach that stage is through kind of Western university settings. The second interpretation is kind of a more relativistic, very easy to say. So anyway, the second interpretation is much more relativistic, such that cultures are seen as encountering different challenges, and so the moral systems that they develop are in response to particular cultural environments. There may be moral values that Kohlberg's model does not include. So kind of the idea here is that there are different environments and kind of circumstances that exist, and those environments can be literal physical environments, you're around a volcano or whatever harsh terrain, but also maybe political reality of the situation. So you're fresh out of colonialism or whatever. You have political reality that exists for you that may be different from other Western countries. You may be in a different economic system. So, if, for example, if you're coming straight out of colonialism, you kind of have an underdeveloped a technocratic class. So basically, the idea here is that you have like kind of less doctors and professional, white-collar professionals that exist within your culture at that time, kind of due to purposeful underfunding of education. So you also may have, you have less money because resources are kind of funneled out of the countries. But it's kind of basically the idea here is that these cultures, they exist within particular countries in different political environments, social environments, economic environments, and within particular historical eras, and thus cultures will kind of, just automatically and kind of reflecting those environmental realities, develop moral systems in response to their particular cultural environments. As a critique of Kohlberg's model, Schrader argues that it represents only one of three different ethics. Schrader proposes three key moral ethics that are evident universally: the ethic of autonomy, the ethic of community, and the ethic of divinity. The West focuses on the ethic of autonomy, while much of the world focuses on the ethic of community and or the ethic of divinity. So kind of the idea here is that there are particular Western values that are going to be reflected in all psychological constructs, but specifically here, this Kohlberg moral development, wherein what is ultimately moral is kind of this idea of autonomy, while ignoring other ethical systems observed across cultures, such as the ethic of community and ethic of divinity. So beginning with the ethic of autonomy, the ethic of autonomy focuses kind of on individual freedom and rights, especially choice and individual liberty. The ethic is related to Kohlberg's model of moral reasoning, which at the highest level of moral reasoning upholds justice and individuality. And Schroeder kind of argues that there really, in the West in particular, tends to focus on the ethic of autonomy. So again, kind of these personal breaches of morality, wherein someone's individually is denying his or her rights, or someone is kind of acting unfairly towards an individual. So it's focused on these. It's very individual rights focused is basically the critique here, and that is kind of a not invalid conceptualization of morality, but what Schroeder's arguing here for is that there are other components of morality that exist and that are seen across cultures. So next, the ethic of community. Morality is tied to an individual's roles in a community or social hierarchy. A breach of morality involves someone who showed a lack of loyalty, betrayed his or her group, or failed to fulfill the duties of his or her role. So, and you can imagine this being higher levels in more collectivist cultures, wherein individuals are more interdependent on each other, thus kind of a violation of a role and kind of expectation within a social hierarchy or community is thus going to be kind of more consequential, theoretically, at a cultural level at least. It's seen as a higher a cultural violation, a higher magnitude cultural violation within kind of these collective cultures, even if that action may be equally harmful across different cultures. It may just be viewed the more harmful in more collectivist cultures, but also there are actions that can be interpreted as violations of higher or lower degrees of violations of this principle of community, because in a culture that values and emphasizes primarily individualism, kind of a going outside of or not conforming or not adhering to a role in the community would be expected to be interpreted less as a kind of violation of morality. But again, kind of adding to the ethics of autonomy, there's also this ethic of community. So how are people's social obligations different from moral versus immoral obligations? Cultural variation in ethics can be studied by looking at whether people consider something to be a moral obligation. That is something that is an objective obligation, kind of meaning that people should do it even if no rules exist to tell people to do it. I should say, and two, is legitimately regulated, meaning that people should be prevented from doing it and should be punished if they do it. If this is not a moral obligation, then it is a personal choice, i.e., a social obligation. And just to highlight some empirical support of the differences in moral obligations, in a study of moral dilemmas that pitted justice, that is autonomy, violations against interpersonal, that is community violations, between American and Indians, researchers found that regardless of the severity of the violations, Indians consistently chose to uphold interpersonal obligations more than Americans did. This suggests that Indians are more likely to consider interpersonal obligations as moral obligations. Even within one country, there can be much variability in moral reasoning. Within each country, while there's a general pattern tending towards certain ways of thinking, there are also many people who would arrive in different solutions to the same moral dilemmas. So kind of the crux of this, and going back to the previous slide, is we have differences between moral obligations and kind of like social personal choices. And in this study, what they did, they basically asked a series of questions and asked two groups, Indians and Americans, to rate to decide which is more important in a scenario. So they basically have two conflicting decisions. They have a scenario where obligations, specifically autonomy obligations and community obligations, are kind of conflicting with each other in a particular scenario. And there are kind of three conditions. So there's minor conflict, moderate conflict, extreme conflict between, again, autonomy and kind of community obligations. And then they asked the participants, Indians and Americans, which choice would you make? Would you make the choice that protects autonomy, ethics, or autonomy, morality, and or community ethics? So would you protect the community or kind of this individual autonomy decision? And on average, Indians selected. Basically, they decided that and considered that interpersonal obligations have a higher degree of moral obligations associated with them. So, in a choice between upholding a community obligation or an autonomy or / justice obligation, and they're conflicting in this experiment. So you have to choose one or the other. On average, Indians will choose and thus kind of value interpersonal obligations as higher levels of moral obligation, which suggests that, in this community, kind of making the broader point here that, and although Kohlberg kind of emphasized those autonomy, those individualistic, those justice-oriented components of morality, other cultures place different components, different moral ethics above the ethic of autonomy, in this case, the ethic of community. But kind of like we talked about in the beginning of this course, there's variation within culture, and you can see even in American cultures and Indian cultures, that's a third to up to a little over 40% of individuals selecting community kind of component of morality as more important than the autonomy, justice component of morality, I should say, American subjects. And also in the Indian participants, with up to about 40% of individuals selecting the justice kind of individual autonomy moral component as a higher level or a more important moral obligation than community ethics. So again, kind of the takeaway here is that there's within country variability, but also we do see cross-cultural differences in the emphasis placed on interpersonal or justice obligations across cultures. And then finally, the ethic of divinity. Morality is that which preserves sanctity in the perceived natural order of things. A breach of morality involves causing impurity or degradation and showing disrespect for God or gods or God or God's creations. People who abide by the ethic of divinity are often concerned with their emotional reactions to violations of natural order. So, and obviously, this also has wide cross-cultural variation on what exactly is the perceived natural order of things, and what is the perceived sanctity of things. And that wide cross-cultural variability can contribute to viewing if one culture viewing an action as moral and another culture viewing an action as immoral. But kind of like overall, the idea here is that the ethic of divinity involves kind of a belief, or often involves a belief, not necessarily, that God or gods has created a sacred world, which an individual should respect and preserve, and one is thus obligated to preserve the standards mandated by this transcendent authority or set of authorities. Our next theory is social learning theory, who is Bandura, R.I.P., recently died. So basically they argue, and he's kind of a prominent social learning theorist, they're interested in the behavioral component of morality, moral behavior learned through observational learning and reinforcement and punishment principles. Moral behaviors are influenced by situational factors. What we do is not always consistent with our moral values and standards. So what they're kind of, again, focused on here is behaviors and learning principles through reinforcement. Just because you have a particular moral standards or you think a certain way doesn't mean that you're going to behave in a certain way. And thus, they are more concerned with behavior. They argue that moral cognition is linked to moral action through self-regulatory mechanisms. They involve monitoring and evaluating our own actions, disapproving of ourselves when we complete doing wrong, and improving others when we behave responsibly or humanely. We apply consequences to ourselves in this way. It allows us to exert self-control, inhibit misbehaving urges, moral disengagement. Allows us to avoid condemning ourselves when we engage in immoral behavior, even though we know the difference between right and wrong. So kind of this idea, kind of self-reflected in the name, is that we have these self-regulatory mechanisms that allow us to monitor and evaluate our behaviors. And through this monitoring process, we're able to emphasize or kind of probabilistically increase the likelihood of moral behaviors and decrease the likelihood of immoral behaviors. And when we violate our kind of moral standards, we can apply consequences to ourselves, and thus kind of over time teach ourselves to inhibit these antisocial behavioral urges. But also an individual is able to disengage morally. So kind of this ability to disengage morally. So when you're in order to get around that self-regulatory mechanism and that kind of self-reinforcement of moral condemnation against yourself, kind of just basically checking out morally is kind of the approach here, which allows us to engage in immoral behaviors without having to undergo that condemnation process, even though you know what is right and wrong. And skipping ahead to empathy in newborns. Newborns display a primitive form of empathy. They are distressed by other infants' cries. By age 1 to 2, they become capable of truer forms of empathy that motivates helping and try to comfort a person in distress. By age 2, ability to take a perspective of the friend. So kind of this idea that through time, by understanding other people have feelings, emotions, attentions, and because they also are empathetic, so those kind of dual processes of empathy development and social cognition, just kind of more broadly, or quote-unquote theory of mind, the individuals are able to recognize that other people have these kind of emotions and then empathize with them and comfort them with age, or increasingly comfort them with age. Research has found prosocial acts by toddlers, helping. 14-month-old infants spontaneously help adults without being asked to. Cooperation. 14-month-old infants participate in cooperative games and will try to get their adult partner re-engaged if they stop playing. and altruistic rather than selfish motivations. Before age 2, show greater happiness when they give treats to appreciative puppy than when they receive them. Prosocial behavior intrinsically rewarding. So at an early age, we see kind of this intrinsic motivation to be prosocial, and young children. And these researchers argue that evidence of this is present in kind of this task of children, where they have a puppet who is kind of just like overly excited and appreciative of the child, and basically in this dynamic or in this experiment, the child is able to take a piece of candy for themselves or give it to this very appreciative puppet. And what the study has found, and some other studies as well, that children at age 2 kind of demonstrate higher levels of happiness when they provide treats to the puppet, this appreciative puppet, rather than themselves. So kind of suggesting that these pro-social behaviors are kind of representative of these biological instincts as kind of like mammals or a very social species. But also at age 2, you're also getting ample environmental influences, and in general, people do not teach their children to just be kind of like selfish assholes. So that socialization process is also possibly evident, depending on what is a particular theorist views as most important. That social learning process is evident at approximately 2 years old. Some researchers, however, argue that humans do not need to learn to be aggressive. They need to learn how not to be aggressive. The frequency of aggression normally rises from infancy to a peak around age 4 and 5 and then decreases. Harsh, coercive parenting, depressed parents, and emotional unavailability or unavailable parents are associated with higher rates of aggression. So kind of this researcher arguing that aggression increases, and again by aggression we don't mean like lethal aggression here, but maybe stealing a toy from someone else or slapping or something along those lines, increasing at up to age 4 to 5 and then decreasing with age. But we've also talked about in previous chapters that the idea of terrible twos is not universal, so kind of the idea of that being a universal process is kind of it's disputed across cultures. But this is kind of the argument of this researcher. And other studies have also found kind of an environmental effect, wherein harsh, coercive parenting or kind of depressed parenting contributing to higher rates of aggression in children as in older children. So this can be speculated to be related to a whole host of things. So in the case of harsh and coercive parenting, maybe a child learning that violence or coercion is the way to solve problems, all the way up to emotional unavailable parents, wherein a child is seeking kind of attention, but the parent unfortunately is like kind of depressed and unable to be attuned to the child's need, and therefore the child may act out and be aggressive to kind of get attention, and because they believe that that is kind of one of the only ways in which they can get attention and kind of meet their needs. And those are just kind of a few possible links or explanations for the correlation between those types of parenting and later rates of aggression. And skipping ahead a little bit, how can parents help children develop a strong conscience? By forming a secure parent-infant attachment, by establishing mutually responsive orientation for caregiver and child, close, emotional, positive, and cooperative relationships in which child and caregivers care about each other. Parents who are responsive to their parents are likely to raise children who are responsive to them. So really not a lot to add here, but kind of the idea that the classic secure parent attachment contributing to a host of positive developmental outcomes according to this theory, and and by also establishing these cycles of mutually responsive, cooperative, and emotionally positive interactions, which between parent and child, which kind of not only allows for practicing of those skills and kind of the development of those approaches to the world, and theoretically empathy and other moral development. But also it kind of serves as like this template wherein they take that same kind of relationship dynamic and apply it to other relationships outside of their household. Children distinguish between different kinds of rules. Moral rules are standards that focus on the welfare and basic rights of individuals. They're absolute, sacred, and unchangeable. Some studies have found that 3-year-olds believe violations of these rules deserve more punishment, such as, and one example, don't beat up the teacher. Social convention rules, standards determined by social consensus that tell us what is appropriate in particular social settings. Don't leave classroom without permission. So basically, children are able to distinguish between these rules that are kind of like life and death versus more of these socially conventional rules. They're more kind of just determined either by social consensus, but kind of just makeshift rules that we use to maintain a certain set of etiquette, or kind of just kind of going through the motions of rules that exist within society that may not actually protect anybody's welfare or like fundamental rights, and may not have life or death circumstances. So when those some studies have found that children will not only make this distinction, but give higher punishment to individuals who break these moral standards, these kind of standards that focus on the welfare and basic rights of individuals, versus these more social convention rules. Again, kind of the example being don't beat up the teacher versus can I leave the classroom without permission? Obviously, if there's a fire or some kind of emergency, you can leave the classroom. But really, very few scenarios wherein you should just beat the hell out of your teacher. Moral socialization. Hoffman weighed the pros and cons of 3 major approaches to disciplining children. Love withdrawal, which is withholding attention, affection, or approval after a child misbehaves, creates anxiety by threatening loss of reinforcement from parents. Power assertion, using power to threaten, chastise, administer spankings, take away privileges, use punishment. And induction, explaining to a child why the behavior is wrong and should be changed by emphasizing how it affects other people, invokes empathy. So basically we have different approaches to moral socialization. The first being withdrawal, so kind of withholding affection and approval, and when a child misbehaves, just kind of creating or thought to possibly be associated with kind of long-term or anxiety in the child, at least in the immediate term, because the child is worried that if they act out, then the attention will be withheld from them and approval will be withheld for them. So therefore, I have anxiety about misbehaving, and therefore kind of not going to do this, thus leading to moral socialization. Versus power assertion, so just using threatening or administering corporal punishments, such as spanking, and take away privileges, just punishment overall to discipline a child, and thus kind of theoretically socialize someone morally. Versus finally explaining why a behavior is wrong to a child and emphasizing how it affects other people. So kind of using that empathetic approach that what you're doing is harming somebody else. Again, encouraging different approaches to disciplining children and theoretically developing morality, and more specifically moral socialization. Moral identity in adolescence. Teens come to view being a moral person who is caring and honest is an essential part of who they are. Adolescents who develop a sense of moral identity tend to be more capable of advanced moral reasoning, especially if something in the situation reminds them of their moral values. They are more likely to act morally than adolescents who do not define themselves in moral terms. Development of moral identity can be fostered by parents, induction or occasional disappointment rather than power assertion or love withdrawal, and fostered via involvement in community service and other pro-social activities. So kind of the idea here is that teens come to develop a moral identity and view themselves as a fair person, a caring person, an honest person, and those descriptions, those kind of components of morality comes a central part of who they are. And in scenarios where their moral values are kind of more evident to them, they are more likely to act on those moral values than adolescents who do not define themselves in moral terms. So adolescents who define themselves in moral terms acting more morally than adolescents who don't, in certain circumstances, specifically in situations that kind of are more explicit in their reminder of their invocation of their particular moral values. And moral development can be fostered by parents, as I stated, but also kind of participating in community, so community service and kind of just broadly speaking, pro-social activities within the household, between peers, or just the community at large. Changes in moral reasoning during adolescence. At 10-year-old, pre-conventional reasoning is the dominant kind of Kohlberg stage of moral reasoning. In the teen years, conventional reasoning the dominant mode, I should say, of moral thinking. In adulthood, post-conventional reasoning emerges, if it emerges at all. So you can just kind of see a higher likelihood of advanced stages of morality according to Kohlberg with age, but even adults do not reach, or many adults, I should say, do not reach post-conventional reasoning. That is that kind of final stage of Kohlberg's moral development. And I should say that on average, many adults do not reach that post-conventional reasoning stage of moral development. Antisocial behavior. The quality of antisocial behavior changes from childhood to adolescence. Physical aggression decreases, while non-aggressive rule breaking such as theft and vandalism increases. Juvenile delinquency, law breaking by a minor. Some diagnosed with conduct disorder, persistent pattern of violating the rights of others or age-appropriate societal norms, fighting, bullying, and cruelty. So kind of the idea here is that antisocial behavior shifts the forms of antisocial behavior. So from going from more physical aggression, so kind of going back to like toddlers, like pushing each other, or pushing around, grabbing a toy or whatever, to more non-aggressive rule breaking, such as theft and vandalism. But those are kind of more normative changes developmentally, or at least in Western cultures, to higher extents. But there are kind of more of a pathological range of antisocial behavior, and specifically conduct disorder, where you have persistent patterns of fighting, bullying, and cruelty. And like I stated before, there are two subsets of antisocial use. There's the early onset subset, which is a seriously disturbed group that is recognized in childhood. Typically, some of the features of this group are hurting others and or animals, and persistently anti-social behavior across the lifespan. Versus later onset group, which was kind of more narrative, or I should say more normative, a less seriously antisocial group that behaves more antisocially during adolescence, and they outgrow that behavior by early adulthood. Next, let's talk about some theories of kind of antisocial youth. And beginning with Dodge's social information processing model. I don't think this is a dog. I'm not sure, but it's probably not the dog. But Dodge, regardless, argued that our reactions to frustration, anger, and provocation depends on the ways in which we process and interpret cues and situations. Aggressive youth develop a hostile attribution bias, deficient or biased information processing, see the world as a hostile place, and quickly assume that any harm to them was deliberate rather than accidental. Many violent youths often experience abandonment, neglect, abuse, bullying that may have given them some cause to view the world as a hostile place and to feel justified in retaliating against individuals they believe are, quote, are out to get them. So kind of the idea here is that for this theory, argues that an individual's reactions to anger and provocation depends on the way that they process the world and interpret kind of the dynamics of a given frustrating situation. And in particular, aggressive youths having this hostile attribution bias, wherein they see kind of behavior and interpret behaviors differently in a more aggressive way. So, for example, you trip over someone's shoes, you accidentally kick someone in the back of the shoe. It's one individual being, maybe pissed off about it, but, understanding that, it's a busy city or whatever. Versus another individual aggressive youths who may have a conduct disorder, interpreting that behavior as the world intentionally doing harm to them, rather than it being accidental. And this is kind of so this kind of automatic processing, or this at least this immediate processing, creates kind of a bias in information processing that can contribute to higher levels of antisocial or aggressive behavior. And it's not only that, but kind of there is developmental antecedents associated with this biased information processing. And that is that many violent youths are typically experience violence committed against them. Abandonment, neglect, abuse, bullying, so violence at interpersonal level, but kind of just as a society, kind of abandoning them, leaving them hanging out to dry. And thus, it's this kind of the hostile attribution bias doesn't just come from the sky. It's just, this is the life that they lived. The world is literally a hostile place towards them. So when people aren't necessarily being hostile towards them, they're still going to interpret it or be prone to interpreting it in a hostile way. And they also feel, just due to this kind of violence committed against them, and abandonment or neglect, abuse committed against them, they feel justified in retaliating against kind of society at large, but just individuals more generally who are quote unquote out to get them, because those individuals, those actions are representative of, in a continuation of, kind of their entire life, or most of their life, or at least kind of very important moments of their life where they were harmed by society, their family, their peers, etc. Next theory is Patterson's coercive family environments theory. Highly antisocial children and adolescents often grow up in coercive family environments. Family members are locked in power struggles, trying to control the other through negative and coercive tactics. Children learn that they can get their parents to lay off them by ignoring requests, whining, massive temper tantrums. As both parents and children learn to rely on coercion to avoid or escape unpleasant encounters, parents lose control over their children's behaviors. Spankings have no effect anymore. An already aggressive child performs poorly in school and is rejected by other children. They join peer groups who are typically low-achieving, antisocial, and unpopular. So the general takeaway here is that individuals grow up in households that are coercive. All family members rely on coercion and kind of blocked in this power struggle for attention, for resources, not just like economic, but like social resources, and just trying to kind of find their place in their household. And thus, again, as I stated, they rely on kind of negative, coercive, heavy, often corporal punishment. And children learn that in order to either to get their attention or just kind of get their parents off their back, because it's such a kind of toxic family environment, that they can throw massive temper tantrums to get their own way, or just kind of ignore their parents or their caregivers' requests. Parents who then kind of relied on corporal punishment, such as spanking or kind of just coercion more generally, that method becomes less effective, because spanking, doesn't hurt as much or whatever, unless you're using more violent methods. But kind of just in general, even if it does, then a child is able to just like leave home. For example, a teenager could just walk out of the house or run away or whatever. Thus, kind of that corporal punishment becomes less effective, and thus behaviors, what was already what level of regulation there was of a child's behavior through corporal punishment is now less effective, and thus a child who's kind of underdeveloped socially, or developed specifically in this coercive environment, and thus kind of has developmental outcomes associated with a coercive developmental context, then enter the world, and kind of due to kind of their behavior and other circumstances, but when they interact with other peers, they're going to be less socially developed. Thus, they will be rejected by other children, and then they will have to form some kind of peer group. And who will they form peer groups with? But other children who are also rejected and are antisocial. And then now you have just a peer group who are kind of a deviant peer group, who are going to kind of feed off each other and contribute to higher probabilities of deviant behavior. Thus, finally creating kind of a juvenile delinquent is kind of the theory here. So to quickly go over this, just changes in moral reasoning in adults. Longitudinal study using kind of Kohlberg's stage theory found that only 1 out of 6 30-year-olds use post-conventional reasoning. So it's not that you automatically reach this level of reasoning, but rather most adults in Western societies do not reach this level of post-conventional reasoning. So although it's universal and you have to go through the stages in order and you can't reach stages until you hit a certain age, that does not necessarily mean that once everyone reaches level 2, whatever stage 2 of that theory, the super majority, according to this longitudinal study, do not reach that level, that post-conventional reasoning, that abstract notions of justice guiding their behavior level of reasoning. And finally, the kind of last cross-cultural component that I want to bring into the class is culture and morality, and looking specifically at different principles of morality. And beginning with the principle of equity, which does appear to be the dominant form of distributing resources in the West. So this basically has to deal with how do we distribute resources within a society. And the principle of equity appears to be the dominant form of distributing resources in the West. And that's based on individuals' contributions. It's common for Western companies to compensate their employees in part by basing their salary on performance and achievements. In much of the rest of the world, and in industries in the West that have more collectivist base through the power of labor unions, distributive justice is maintained more by applying the principle of equality, sharing resources equally among the group. Equality tends to be preserved within a certain range of constraints, such as one's age or official credentials. All employees might get the same size raise each year, but those who have been at the company longer have received more raises, and therefore their total compensation is greater. Seniority system weakens the link between inputs and outputs, but harmonious relationships in the workplace are protected because of the lack of competition. So we basically have 3 competing ways of distributing resources. So morally, what is the correct moral way to distribute resources within a country? And we're talking about 2 in this slide, and that's theories of equity and equality. And there's also a theory of need that we'll get to momentarily. But equity is kind of like this meritocracy. It's kind of what you put, theoretically, compensating your employees based on their performance achievement, I should say. First is this principle of equality, which is sharing resources equally kind of among the group. And however, it's in general across cultures, this equality principle, it's not kind of a global principle of equality, but rather there are certain constraints, such as a person's age and credentials. So, and a particular study found that in Japan that seniority can, within a company, contributing to who gets the highest raise within a given year. So, for example, all employees receive a raise, but employees with who have spent the most time at the company receiving a slightly larger raise or a larger raise than the other employees. And therefore their total compensation is greater. So it's kind of everybody's kind of getting increased, but within a set of constraints. And the level of constraints and the frequency of constraints, the level of constraints and the specific constraints themselves differ by culture. In this case, one of them being seniority. So kind of the idea here is more globally the link between inputs and outputs, aka the stuff that you're creating and then the money that you're getting, is weakened. But the argument here, and in the case of this Japanese study, is that by weakening that relationship between inputs and outputs, it creates decreases competition or urges within the workplace against each other, and this creates more of a harmonious relationship in the workplace, kind of going back to this the value of interpersonal relationships within a given culture. And it's not just in Japan, but other studies have found that in Western European countries that have higher levels of unionization rely more on the distributed theory of justice, that is the principle of equality, compared to the United States, which tends to primarily focus on the principle of equity. wherein that relationship between inputs and outputs are stronger, and it's based on these person's individual contributions to society or a particular company. And researchers set to measure these differences empirically. Researchers presented Indian and American participants with a scenario in which a company manager has to make a decision about dividing a bonus sum between two employees. One of the employees was described as having excellent work performance and an adequate economic situation. The other employee had only average work performance, but was in a poor financial situation with an illness in the family. Participants can choose to give most of the money to the excellent worker, give most of the money to the needy worker, or split the money evenly down the middle. The most popular solution for the Americans was to favor the excellent employee, that is the principle of equity. And the least popular one was to favor the needy employee, that is the principle of equity or need. Favorable solution of Indians was to give the majority of the money to the needy employee, and the least favorable solution was to reward the excellent employee. So again, kind of the scenario here is that that there's this bonus in the company, and you can give it to anybody you want, or well, in this case, between two employees, and you can give them or one of the employees is just a super worker but has adequate economic situation, while the other employee is average worker but is poor. But lives in a poor household, and one of their family member has like a chronic illness. And then you ask the participants who they would give the money to, and they can choose to give all the money to the excellent worker, all the money, or most of the money, I should say, to the needy worker, or just kind of split it down the middle. And Americans, as stated, rely on the principle of equity, that is distributing the money based on the individual's contributions. And that is thus the person who is the excellent employee in the adequate with adequate economic situation. But again, this is on average, and there are respondents who responded differently, but these are group averages. And the least popular vote was to favor the needy employee. That is the equity principle of equity, or equality, I should say, wherein we share the resources equally, so either splitting it half and half, or the principle of need, that is giving it, basically the principle of need is allocating resources based on people who need it the most. So that being the least favorable among American participants. But the favorite solution of Indians, as I stated, was to give the majority of the money to the needy employee, and the least favored solution was to reward the excellent employee. So kind of opposite trends reflecting these cultural differences of what is moral, how, and in this case, how that's translate to particular behaviors, and in this case, how do you distribute resources within society, and in particular, how do you distribute bonus sums within a company, and specifically between these two individuals. And our last moral theory is kind of this moral intuition and emotional theory. And Green has proposed a dual process model of morality. Both deliberate thought and intuition/emotion play distinctive roles. Explains why we sometimes make judgments based on quick, emotional-based intuitions, other times make judgments using more deliberative cognitive processes. Use different parts of the brain to make intuitive and deliberative moral decisions. So basically the argument here is that both deliberate thought and this emotion and kind of more reactive, intuitive processing of morality and decision-making process play distinct roles. And because sometimes, basically this author is arguing that sometimes you have to make a quick decision, other times you have more time, and thus can take your time to go about this deliberative cognitive process. And these two different approaches, deliberate thought and intuition, emotion, and / emotion, play distinct roles, but they kind of also interact. And thus, kind of like the time that an individual has to make a decision contributes to their moral behaviors ultimately, because they have more time to deliberate on and make potentially more sound judgments when deciding what to do morally. And just a couple of concepts to wrap up with. Religiousness, sharing the beliefs and participating in the practices of an organized religion. And spirituality, involving a quest for ultimate meaning and for a connection with something greater than oneself. Religiousness and spirituality may be beneficial in late adulthood. Some studies have found that it's linked to having a sense of meaning and purpose in life, and can provide participation in a caring community. So basically, the studies are trying to get at here is what aspect of this spirituality or religiousness is contributing to potential development of positive developmental outcomes, and that could just be interacting with peers, making friends, participating in some community activities. Just kind of developing a social network. But interestingly, we see that church membership in the U.S. Has declined throughout the past basically 80 years, which is interesting because that is such a primary vehicle of kind of social participation within the United States. In particular, and we also understand that individualism is increasing in the United States. So you're getting this kind of dual pattern where individualism increasing and kind of community participation and empowerment decreasing. And that's reflective in not just in kind of church membership, but also union membership and kind of just friendships as well, just kind of social participation within the country and the communities decreasing. Thus kind of creating this social vacuum and really this isolation, in which can have adverse developmental outcomes across multiple cohorts. And how our country kind of deals with that remains to be unseen. These loss of social support, older adults living longer, thus requiring more needs with age, but having less kind of resources available to them, being more socially isolated, and not just older adults, but the entire cohorts who will never experience kind of workplace solidarity through unionization or church membership or kind of just community participation at large. What that does, what that generational shift is, or will contribute to, what specific outcomes that will be associated with, remains to be unseen, but it's a factor to keep in mind moving forward. And that's all for this week. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.